So Mrs. Ostermeyer was telling us about how Malcolm X was an influence on you while you were trying to keep the peace in Durham, and we wanted to ask you, when did you first hear about him, and what was his influence?
Okay, when did I first hear about Malcolm X?
Yes.
Okay, his picture's right there, and he's sort of always with me. Actually, I was in graduate school. I know these years are going to blow you all the way, but back in 1964. So I was working on my master's degree, and this is the first time I'd actually heard about Malcolm X. And he was actually coming to Cleveland to debate a guy named Louis Lomax. And Louis Lomax wrote a book called The Fire Next Time, or something like that, which was a book about the Nation of Islam. So there were two events. One was in the afternoon, where most of the people who came obviously were not working class people. These were, people who had professional jobs and so forth. So there was a discussion between Malcolm and Louis Lomax there, and that audience was like more in favor of Louis Lomax. That night, they had an event at a church called Corey Methodist Church, huge church in Cleveland, and it was packed, except now what you had were, low-income and working class people, and they clearly were in support of Malcolm. And it was the first time I really heard him give a formal speech, and I was just blown away by the power of his words and what he had to say, and how it made me feel as a young black man, at that point in history. So from that point on, I began to follow Malcolm X and to try to, read about him and understand what he was about. And so the greatest impact that he had on me was really making me feel positive as a black person and as a young black man, and then giving me, more clarity on sort of the importance of engaging in a struggle to make the poorest people's lives better. So, but King had an impact on me too. It was just different, because the first time I saw Martin Luther King speak actually was in that same church. It's just that they came at the problem from two totally different viewpoints, and two different religious points of view, but also just in terms of history and all of that. So they both had an impact on me, but Malcolm probably had the greatest impact.
Okay. Do you want to ask? Yeah.
Okay. It is said that you were hired in 1965 by Operation Breakthrough because of not of your organization skills, but because of your affiliation with the Moderate Urban League, which made you acceptable to the whites in Durham. Would you have considered yourself a moderate back then?
What's interesting is I never put labels on myself. I let other people put labels on me. I just do what I think is right and let other people label it. But I think it's safe to say that I had a master's degree in social work. I had worked 1 year for the Urban League. And so when I went down to interview for the job, they were looking for a black person who had a social work background and also had a, quote, community organizing background, which most people didn't even understand what that meant. So I think it's probably safe to say that they probably felt that I was a pretty safe person to hire. I probably thought I was a pretty safe person to hire, so that's probably accurate.
So, how organized or disorganized was Durham when you arrived?
Well, there weren't any of the kind of organizations that we put together. There was an organization in the black community called the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, is what I think it was called. And this was sort of a historic organization, had been around a long time. but it was essentially an organization of the black middle and upper class in Durham. And what they did to a large degree was to try to impact the black vote, and then try to use their ability to impact the black vote to win concessions, from the white community. The kind of organizing that I did and that I helped create in Durham was to organize poor people, was to go into housing projects and into some of the worst areas of the city and get people who had previously not been engaged in trying to change their own lives to get engaged. So it was a different form of organizing, and it was focused on a very different group of people.
The book Our Separate Ways mentions the relationship between C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater.
Yeah.
Do you think that relationship helped make positive connections between the poor white community and the poor black community?
First of all, the relationship between C.P. and Ann occurred later in terms of the work that we had done. And so, in fact, for most of the time that I was engaged in the work, C.P. was like a member of the Klan and, was very negative towards what we were doing. I really, other than the friendship between C.P. and Ann, it would be interesting to ask Ann what she thought or thinks, but I don't know that it necessarily had that. I know it didn't have that much of an impact on the work that we did early on. Whether or not it had any impact on work later on, I really can't say, but I really don't think so. I don't think that CP brought like poor whites necessarily to the table, and then black people and poor white people start working together by virtue of CP and Ann's friendship. That's just my feeling now. To be honest, it's been a long time since I read their book, because they have a book called Best of Enemies, and they may talk more about it in that book, but from my standpoint, I would say no.